Welcome back to Psychedelics Today, everybody. This is a Solidarity Friday episode. We have quite the episode for you. 5 of us here, which is kind of a lot for a Friday episode, but really excited because we get to talk with the researchers who are in charge of the recent self-blinded microdosing study that got a lot of press in the last couple of weeks. Balázs, could you give us the title of your study?
Yes, so the title was Self-Blinding Citizen Science to Explore Psychedelic Microdosing. I hope I got that right, but I think that was it.
Sounds like you got it. Too. Great. And so Balázs and David, you're here with us. Were you the 2 leads on the paper?
Yes, so I'm the first author, which is basically the lead researcher, and David is the last author, who is the senior researcher, which in practice means that I did most of the stuff by closely collaborating with David.
Okay.
and I take the credit, and I was the PI on the study, so the principal investigator. So yeah, together Excellent. We have kind of given birth together, and then had other people helping as well that are also co-authors, obviously.
Excellent. All right, great. Yeah, Kyle, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna welcome Dr. David Erritzoe and Dr. Balázs Szigeti to the show. Thank you for being with us. And for any of the listeners that want to get a little bit of a background about this study as well, you could go back into our podcast archive and check out the episode that we did when they were launching this study. I think it was we had you guys on back in 2018. I think I went back into the archive and that's when we were on. So I'm really excited to just chat with you guys. And we had you on as you were launching the study to talk about it and promote it. And now you have the results. So excited to dig in and learn about what you've learned from this study.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us back. Yeah, okay. So let's first really unpack what is self-blinding. Some of the listeners might be familiar with that from that past episode that you mentioned, but for those that will hear about it for the first time, I think it's important to understand the structure of the study. So what was unique about this study is that we have developed a method how microdosers at home can implement their own placebo control without clinical supervision. And this is the process that we call self-blinding. Blinding has a very specific meaning in science, in medical research, and when you are blinded, it means that you do not know whether you are part of the control group or whether you are taking an active drug. So that's why we call this process self-blinding, because you are blinding yourself. Now, I am not going to go through the entire process of self-blinding, but just to give the listeners an idea quickly, the main trick is that we ask participants to hide their microdoses inside non-transparent gel capsules. And then obviously the empty capsules can be used as placebo capsules in this way. So there were these 2 sets of capsules, and then participants needed to put them into zip bags and envelopes and shuffle them, generate a random number here and there, pull some envelopes, scan some of the QR codes involved in the experiment, so on and so on and so on. And the net result of this self-blinding process is that they ended up with capsules enough for 4 weeks, but they did not know which of those capsules are microdose, which of those capsules are placebo. And the other big part of the self-blinding process is that when participants scanned some of these QR codes that linked with the IT infrastructure of our study, and that gave us a way to track who is doing placebo or microdose when. So participants did not know what they were taking at the time, but we, the researchers, had a way of tracking who is taking what. So that's really this self-blinding structure. And to the best of our knowledge, our study is the first self-blinding study, not just in the realm of psychedelics research, but more broadly in medical research as well. And then to that start, then with the results, and then just what justifies this design, and this is something that I am personally probably the most proud of, and that this was the largest placebo-controlled study of psychedelics by a fairly large margin. I mean, obviously, that meant to be for up to date. I'm sure that in the future there are going to be larger ones, but up to this point, this was the largest, and again by a large margin. It was completed by 191 participants. And in this field, typically studies even with 50 people are considered big. So we are like 4 times as big as many of these studies. So that really big sample size, that's really the strength of the study. And when we started doing this research, that was really the vision, is that cell binding gives a way to do a study that has the placebo control via the cell binding and also has a large sample size, which is very, very rare in clinical research with psychedelics. David, you want to add anything?
No, I guess maybe I'll add that people might think, why did we already do a podcast with you guys way before we even did the study? And I think that actually is related to this pretty exciting method that Balázs came up with, and that we then developed and put into practice together. That it's a pretty smart and cost-effective way of assessing something that happens out in real life in a naturalistic setting that we could then study on a relatively large scale for very little cost, because it's all done via the online platform. I think that's why there were interest from different sites already at the early phase, which is a bit unusual when you start a trial, that you start talking about before you've done it. That's because the method in itself is at least as interesting as the results. Then it turned out that the results also are quite, interesting, and to some people maybe quite surprising. So yeah, maybe I just wanted to add that to what Balázs just said, nicely explaining the study.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I forget, was it you gave the option of doing psilocybin or LSD or both for this study?
Yeah, so when we launched the study, then it was just LSD or other LSD-like substances like 1P-LSD or 1CP-LSD. But then I think somewhere in early 2019, we launched a mushroom version of the protocol, which is actually a little bit more complicated than the LSD version. And the reason for that is because most people use about 0.1, 0.2 grams of dried mushroom as their microdose. But that weight is big enough so that you can distinguish it from the placebo capsules just based on their weight. So then the placebo capsules needed to be filled with an equal weight of non-psychoactive substances. So anyway, that way it was a little bit lagging behind the LSD protocol. And actually in the final results, basically 2/3 of the people have used LSD or one of these LSD variants like 1P-LSD, and the remaining 1/3 used mushroom. So definitely our data is
awesome.
Dominated by LSD microdosers.
Yeah, and I guess it made sense for us to try to expand first for simplicity, and because of this new method, it was the first way of doing it was with the blotter base because of the practicalities, and then Balázs figured out that we could also do it with the dried mushroom. And when we look at the sort of data from other centers looking at microdoses, it's a lot of places, around half of people who prefer to microdose with LSD or 1P-LSD, and the other half with dried mushroom material, and it's very, very few who do it with other psychedelics. So those are the two. So it was good that we sort of expanded the study also to allow dried mushroom microdoses into the study as well. But then I don't know if you want to go into that, Balázs, but there's a little bit of a funny thing related to a potential problem with the plant-based, not plant-based because mushroom's not really a plant, but dried mushroom material based. Do you want to mention that just for the fun of it?
It's just a funny anecdote. But basically, when we launched the mushroom protocol, very quickly there was feedback from a few people that they are always breaking blind, meaning that they figure out what is their drug condition. And the reason for that is because when, obviously you ingest a capsule, and then sometimes you're burping a little bit. And they said, that from the burp had a little bit of a mushroomy aftertaste to it. So just, basically from that, it's very easy for them to figure out when they are taking the mushroom capsule and when they are taking the placebo. So actually, we had to throw away a little bit of data because of that. I think it was 5 individuals, and their data had to be thrown away. And then after that, the instructions changed that you needed to fill the placebo capsules with an equal weight of a non-psychoactive mushroom. So in the protocol, we recommended the shaga mushroom, which you can buy basically anywhere in any natural health shops. It's meant to be immune system booster. But importantly, that's also a mushroom. So the mushroomy burps didn't give away whether you are placeboing or microdosing.
Yeah, the not very known burping problem in clinical trials, but
yeah, when I talked to one other science journalist, like she was joking around that from this story, she knows for sure that we did the study because you wouldn't be able to figure it out just by thinking about it that burping is going to be a problem in the study.
No.
But there you go.
You're right. So we didn't invent all the
That's
data.
kind of funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, like this won't happen with isolated or synthesized psilocybin. It's too small of a dose number to really burp it up, right?
Yeah. I mean, bear in mind, like they even the dry psilocybin mushroom, like the psilocybin content is fairly small. So the vast majority of what you are digesting is not it's not the psychedelic. It's just all of the other stuff in the mushroom.
Yeah, so it's probably not the psilocybin molecule that people can taste in the mouth. It might be other mushroom components.
I've tasted plenty of mushrooms.
Material, probably.
It's not super pleasant most of the time, but you get through it. And okay, so the most amazing thing, I'm feeling like I'm chomping at the bit here. The most amazing thing to me is your results, and that results seem to be, what was the term? No statistical difference between the groups, placebo and non-placebo.
Yes. So in terms of like the results, so let's break it down because this was a fairly complex study with many different outcomes. But what we very clearly defined as the primary outcome of the study was a change in psychological well-being from baseline to after the 4 weeks long microdosing regime. And it's important at this point to emphasize that our study is the first placebo-controlled study that assessed repeated microdosing. All of the clinical studies, the few that are out there, they are only about the single administration of a microdose and what are the effects a few hours afterwards. But here we did something different. What we assessed is we called it in the paper the accumulative or the long-term effects of microdosing. How is it going to change you if you are microdosing it for a month? Which from a clinical perspective is much more interesting compared to what happens a few hours after you have taken microdose. So there was these accumulative outcomes, and even within these accumulative outcomes, like basically we had the psychological assessments. Let's focus on psychological well-being. But basically everything that we measured works the same way. Like qualitatively, it's true for all of the other results. So if you look at psychological well-being, and first let's just focus on people in the microdose group. So these are people who were taking microdoses for 4 weeks. And relative to their baseline, their well-being has increased in a significant manner. So what that means is that it actually validates a lot of the anecdotes about microdosing, because after 4 weeks of microdosing, participants really did feel better in terms of their psychological well-being. So far, so good. But the interesting bit is that if you put the placebo group next to it, so these are people who were microdosing only taking placebos for 4 weeks. But the placebo group did improve in a similar manner as well. And the difference between the placebo and the microdose group are not significantly different anymore. The microdose group people improved a little bit more, but there is a fairly large overlap in terms of the error bars if you look at the figures in the paper. So, each of these groups, improved significantly relative to their baseline. So they improved after 4 weeks of either taking placebos and microdoses, but the difference is not statistically significant, meaning that you will not feel better after 4 weeks of microdosing relative to 4 weeks of taking placebos.
Maybe we should just, before you go into the other aspects of the trial, the acute effects, Balázs, maybe we should say that then one thing that people might then argue would be, okay, fair enough. But if there was a non-significant difference, so there was something in the direction that would favor microdosing, then it could be a matter of statistical power, meaning that what if we just had enough people in the trial? Would it then end up being statistically significant? And that will always be the case. I mean, if you have any difference between two groups, yes, if you scale it up and the pattern keeps being the same, then at some point, if you have enough people in the groups, then at some point, if the pattern is the same in the data, then there will be a statistically significant difference. But we could also calculate, which is relatively straightforward to do, I think, how many people would you need with the same pattern of results in order to actually separate statistically significantly between these two groups. And that is high numbers. It's like 1,500 people. And that means that we are into such small effects that it is not that relevant, because the differences are so small between the groups that it didn't reach significance even in this trial that, as Balázs said, was the biggest trial done with any placebo control so far in any psychedelic studies, and actually quite a lot bigger than previous trials. So therefore, that argument falls a little bit flat, because if the effects are so small, then it's not that interesting. So I guess it is disappointing result for people who would expect and hope, anticipate that microdosing produce significant better results for this pretty central, the primary outcome, which was well-being on a validated scale. And also for the people who might have struggled to understand the method, it's important to say, when Balázs talks about psychological measures and so on, everything are in scales and tests sitting online on an online platform. So it's not that the investigators or ourselves and our other colleagues, we have not physically met any of these people. They just signed up with an email and consented to the conditions of the study, that it was on their own initiatives, using their own drugs and so on, and then they could participate from wherever they were in the world. So so these testing and scales and stuff we did, it was all sitting on an online platform. I just want to re-mention that to make sure people get it.
Yeah. And then one thing which I would like to add here, just talking about the long-term effects. So one thing which you also measured was cognitive performance. And that was a little bit different compared to all of the other measures, because all of the psychological measures that I have mentioned, these are basically self-report questionnaires. So it's the scientific version of how are you? And it's broken down into more questions, but essentially, it's like a bunch of questions, and you are responding. It's self-report, because you are evaluating your own well-being, which is obviously a little bit biased relative if an external evaluator would have rated. But these cognitive performance measures that we did, they're more objective. Like, it's very easy to, cheat, so to speak, on these self-rated questionnaires, because you can just always report that, I am feeling fantastic. But you cannot really, pretend to have a better reaction time or a better memory performance in this cognitive performance test. So that is a more objective evaluation. It's a different domain, but a more objective measurement technology. And when it comes to this cognitive performance, we did not find any difference either in the placebo or in the microdose group. So during this, after the 4 weeks of either taking placebos or microdoses, people were just as sharp cognitively as before the microdosing. And because this is in a way a stricter measurement, and the fact that here we did not find anything, not even relative to the people's baseline measure, I think that again just strengthens that narrative to me. Like, when we started to analyze the data, that's something that really jumped out at us, is that, like, basically all of the self-reported scale behaved in a certain way that you prove relative to your baseline, but no between group. But then there was just this cognitive performance, which was different, where you do not even improve relative to your baseline. So I wanted to add that, because I think that's just another important element of the results. So that's about the accumulative ones. And then the other big outcome type that we had are the acute outcomes. So this is what happens a few hours after you have ingested the microdose. And we have analyzed the data in two separate ways. And the first one is really the traditional analysis. And in this traditional analysis, we did not consider who is breaking blind. So who is figuring out what is their drug condition? I'm going to return to that in a minute, but first just let's focus on the simple analysis where you don't consider that. And when we did that, we find some significant differences between placebo and microdose. But it goes back to a little bit to what David was saying earlier, that those differences are very, very small. And, the technical term is that it is statistically significant, but not clinically significant. And here, if I may, just I think a very useful analogy is just, let's forget about microdosing for a minute and let's talk about something which is much more familiar and what is clinical significance in that context. So let's say that we are developing a medication for fever. And then let's say, we have a new drug and we run a study, and then we show that there is a statistically significant difference between placebo and our new fever medication. And you can get statistical significance no matter how small is that difference. Basically, just need the smaller the effect, the smaller the difference, the larger sample size you get. But you can always make a difference statistically significant with the bigger sample. So it could be the case that fever medication is reliably lowering your body temperature with, let's say, 0.5 Celsius degree. And then, very likely then this drug would get approval, and, then it, in the paper you would report that there was a statistically significant difference between your medication and placebo. But it's very obvious that this medication would not be effective because it just brings down your body temperature with 0.5 Celsius degrees, which is not much in terms of practical getting better. So what we have found with these acute outcomes is analogous to that, is that people in the microdose group did very, very slightly better. But when I mean very, very slightly, I mean that sincerely, that it is not something which would have a practical value. So there is that. And then let's talk about what I think is the most interesting part of the paper, and that is when you are considering the break blind. So who is figuring out that drug condition?
So can I just interrupt 1 second? Sorry, it's David here again. I just want to say that we use in this paper, we use the term break blind and breaking blind. And it did cause a little bit of confusion, I could see on Twitter, that some people who didn't read the paper, then they just looked at that word and thought that meant that when you in a clinical trial, when you are going in and interrupting the trial and breaking the blind, that's not what we mean here. We basically mean that they are able to guess where they are, what they got, and therefore they are not blinded. But it's not that there has been a breaking of the blind in the trial. So it just means, if you just maybe explain that a bit more, Balázs, so people understand.
Yeah, good point. So what we did is that on these acute measurement days, this should always Thursday on the study. So as I said, the people have either taken placebos or microdoses for 4 weeks, and on every Thursday, they took a capsule in the morning, and we asked them to complete a set of tests 2 to 6 hours after they have taken that capsule. And they have done the test, and the very, very last question on all of these questionnaires is that, take a guess. What do you think? What do you take earlier? Was it a placebo or was it a microdose capsule? And then we use that information to basically break down these acute data into 4 categories. And the 4 categories are basically a stratification, a 2x2 stratification, where we look at condition and guess. And condition is your actual drug condition, so what you have taken. And it was either a placebo or microdose. And then the other factor in this analysis is the guess, what you think you have taken. And again, it can have a value of either a placebo or microdose. So in this way, you are stratifying the data into 4 categories with this condition times guess analysis. And I'm going to tell you numbers about what we use as the acute mood scale, which is called PANAS, the positive and negative affection scale. But basically, it's the same story for all of the other outcomes as well. So if you are looking at people who have taken a placebo and they think they have taken a placebo, then on this particular scale, they score about 13 points. Basically, that's your baseline, so to speak, in this outcome. If you look at people who have taken a microdose, but they think it was a placebo, they score a little bit higher. I think it was about 13.8, but the difference is not statistically significant. They score a little bit better, but it's actually highly non-significant, the difference. But then things going to get really interesting in the next category when people have taken a placebo, but when they think it was a microdose, then the score goes up all the way to 18, which is a very large jump compared to the 13, which was the value when people have taken a placebo and thought it was a placebo. And the difference between the first and the third case is statistically highly significant. And notice that in both of these cases, people have taken a placebo, so there is no difference in their drug condition. The only difference between these two strata is that in the first case, they thought it was a placebo. In the second case, they thought it was a microdose. And the difference in what they have guessed that they have taken is the reason why the scores are jumping up so high in this particular scale. But again, this is something which was true for all of the outcomes that we have measured acutely, except one. And probably you can see what's coming because we also measured cognitive performance acutely as well. So that more objective measure that I have mentioned in the context of the long-term outcomes as well. And when it comes to the cognitive performance, neither the condition nor the guess makes a difference in your performance. So again, the fact that the cognitive performance is it's less susceptible to the placebo effect because it is a more objective measure. And that again here in the acute measure, we find a very strong signature of the placebo effect in this guess analysis, but we do not find it in the more objective cognitive performance analysis. To me, that's put together, that's pretty strong evidence.
So I guess maybe a little bit simplified version of some of what Balázs explained more in detail here. And Balázs, correct me if I'm wrong in saying this, that if you really simplify it, you can say that, and you scrutinize these data a bit differently, that in a way the guess was 10 times better predictor of some of these acute outcomes than was the actual condition, what they actually took.
Yes, that's correct.
That's fascinating.
So yeah, there you go. Those are the big ones. It's a quite rich paper. There is really it's very long and very rich with the very long supplementary materials. But I think those are the big highlights of the results.
Right. So we discussed your paper a little bit last week on a Friday episode, and you measured specific things, right? This is what studies do. You measure specific things, and you can't measure everything, right? Like that would be kind of like asking for NASA level funding for something like this. And yeah,
it would also bore people to absolute death if we asked them everything. they would drop out massively on such a survey trial. We already asked them almost too much because it's tiring, and we had a very good retainment. People stayed in the study better than they did in our previous survey studies. And that's probably because people were very engaged. This thing that they had to put all this, follow this manual, play the game with us, and do all this blinding work themselves. I think that kept them curious about staying in the study to also get the results in the end. When they were done with the study, potentially they could get the results. So we had actually much better coherence. We had people staying in the study much better than other trials. But one way of making sure to get rid of people in such a trial is to overload it with too many measures and too many tests, because then you fatigue people and they disappear out of the study, and then you are left without knowing who was it who left the study, and then you have even bigger problems.
Amazing. Okay, so we speculated that there could be actual things happening that are beneficial. We speculated on perhaps like healing the brain through microdosing, actual brain injury stuff. But we don't have any good data on that yet. So, I personally kind of enjoy LSD microdosing. It feels good. It's not, it feels healthier than taking something like an Adderall. In that, I'm not feeling like I'm tripping. I'm not feeling high. I hope I'm getting a microdose. But it feels helpful.
Yeah.
And it feels healthy. Like I can't really speculate for sure that it's healing brain injury or anything like that. But it's an interesting topic. Like what could be happening?
Yeah, so in a way, I would say that the study confirms that.
Yeah.
Because if you, what Balázs said in the very beginning was that if we ignore the whole placebo group, ignore the whole placebo condition, and just look at the people who were microdosing in the entire period, when you look at all the different data, the baseline, which is before they started doing the 4-week microdosing, and then after this period, the cumulative data, but without the placebo, then we could see there was a significant improvement in most of the things. So that is basically confirming what you're saying. You feel that it is improving. The interesting thing about this trial, and basically a lot of trials that have a placebo condition, is that when you also add that into your trial, then we can just see that people did equally well. It improved to the same degree after placebo. So in a way, the study validates that people do feel better on a lot of parameters, whatever we measure, pre to post microdosing. So, and that is what you're experiencing. And I'm not trying to invalidate your experience by saying this is placebo, but I'm saying it could be, because that's what the trial actually came up with. But it doesn't mean that those experiences are not real. It's just that a lot of those effects come from a combination of hoping, believing, expecting things to become better, and then your mind do magical tricks. And that's the beauty of placebo, and particularly when it comes to the mental health and well-being and so on. And when this is a very hyped, very popular subcultural thing, you belong to a group of people who are, going a bit against conventional stuff, going against big pharma, going against medications that are prescribed by myself and other psychiatrists, and doing something that is a bit more like a subculture, a little bit anti-establishment. You belong to an interesting group. You are interesting at work because you're doing this instead of, more conventional things. And all that builds to the expectation within the people who are doing it, particularly in this early phase of something that is a new phenomenon. It isn't quite new phenomenon, microdosing. And all that, adds to the list of why it might have great placebo effects. And it does. And so I'm not saying that it's not really working, and it could be. This is not a neuroscience study, even though we are neuroscientists. This study is, as we have mentioned several times, a survey-based study where we didn't meet people. That means we couldn't do any neuroscience on people here. We couldn't do brain imaging. We couldn't measure plasticity in the blood, in the brain. We are planning to do that in a follow-up study where we will do neuroscience to see whether there are effects. And then it'll be very interesting if there are some effects, but it still doesn't improve people more than placebo. But anyway, that we're going to explore in future studies.
Yeah, I think it's very key what David said, and like obviously, there's a bit of a backlash, now from the microdosing community towards us. But and something that we always emphasize with David when we talk about this study, and as I mentioned earlier, that based on our data, there is no question that people feel better after microdosing. It is just that people feel equally better after they have taken a placebo. Obviously, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's basically the whole story. Like we very clearly see improvements in a wide range of psychological domains with people who are microdosing, but also with people who are taking placebos. But actually, let me go back and clarify myself a little bit, because I think there is a key word which is missing there. And that is that people who are taking deceptive placebos. Like I would not expect people to feel better who are just like taking, placebos knowing that they're completely empty inside. Like, in this study, like in most medical studies, like, people are aware that there is a chance that it's going to be a microdose or a placebo. And I think that's very important to activate this expectation of benefits. So, it's not that, people taking empty capsules. Nobody in the field would expect people to feel better if they are knowingly taking empty capsules. I think here they are feeling better even when they're taking the placebo, because they know that there is a chance that they are getting the microdose. So I think that element of deception is a very important component for the placebo effect to really work.
I think personally that's so interesting. And I actually wanted to ask you guys, I thought another interesting part about, the people who participated in this study after reading the whole paper. So it is all people that have had previous psychedelic experiences, right? They had recreational use. But
Correct.
B, didn't they all also kind of, go in with the expectation that they thought it was going to be beneficial? And so isn't this kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy? And I guess I wonder what would happen if you did the same study on totally psychedelic naive people, like they often do in those big dose psilocybin studies. Do you think that it would be similar results, or do you think that could change the results?
I think it's a very important question, basically, because so in all the first early work that we at Imperial, but also other centers have been doing, no, actually not, Johns Hopkins did very early on studies with full dose psilocybin in naive. We did it in experienced users because we come from brain imaging, basically, so a lot of our stuff happened in the scanner, and in order for that to be realistic and safe and working well and people not freaking out while they're also lying in a massive donut making weird sounds, we basically did it with people who had some experiences and therefore increasing the likelihood of everything going well. But you're right. Some of the studies with the full doses, and particularly the early work from Johns Hopkins, we have also recently done a big study in naive, and we are doing another one with a company actually with DMT at the moment. None of that is published, but a lot of it has been done, yes, and is being done in psychedelic naive, and it is very interesting to do that. It's a little bit complicated in an opportunistic, naturalistic sample that needs to be ethically approved, where we are basically stepping in and interfering with something that people are doing out in the real world. It was a big mouthful for ethics at Imperial to basically swallow and approve this kind of study, because it's a complete kind of new model that because it's not just observing people doing something that is, one, illegal, and two, out of our control, and in a lot of people who are not very much into the psychedelic space, potentially could this be dangerous? So therefore we did the trial in this way also to make sure that it seemed safe for everybody who were involved also in approving it. And it would be a little bit tricky to do this kind of study in psychedelic naive. If you really want to do the perfect microdosing study, you would do it as super expensive, proper clinical trial in a psychedelic naive population as well, definitely in large sample size. And that is that where you have randomization, placebo control, and full control of the doses that people are taking in the trial, and so on. That's the proper real way to do a proper clinical trial. This was obviously an interesting attempt to do something that was exploiting that people are doing this in the real world, and therefore being able to scale up a big study for very little cost in order to produce early evidence data about microdosing and whether it seemed to work beyond placebo. But you're right. In this kind of study, it's a bit difficult to do it in naive, but that would be very interesting to do.
Yeah, I would expect the results to be quite different in a psychedelic naive sample. And I remember when I was giving talks to various psychedelic societies promoting the study, one thing, that I often said is that, for example, I think I used my father as an example. He's a university professor, quite down to earth, quite materialistic and scientific in his worldview. And if I tell him about microdosing, to him it's just like woo woo, So if he would enroll in one of these studies, he wouldn't be very excited about microdosing. He would be like, okay, let's do it, whatever. But he wouldn't be excited about it, and he wouldn't expect the benefit. I compare that, with the average psychedelic users who are very excited about, microdosing, who know that this is going to be a great conversation at that next dinner party or Zoom party in COVID times. But anyway, you get the point. The point is that difference in excitement and that difference in the expectation of benefits those are key driving components of a strong placebo response. And if you take those away, and you have a population which is not so positive about psychedelics, probably the placebo response would be smaller as well. But bear in mind, it also means that probably the effect in the microdose group would be smaller as well, because certainly in the microdose group, the placebo is also a component.
Very interesting. No, thank you for explaining that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So one thing, which I think might be good to mention here, because David mentioned, clinical studies and obviously, what many people are bringing up, how can you call this a study because doses were not controlled and there was no controlled drug supply, which obviously it's fair criticism. We are very explicit about that in the limitations. I mean, actually, I think even the limitation section of the paper starts with that the major limitation of the study is the lack of controlled drug supply. But one thing which is really the strength of our study is that it assesses accurately real life microdosing.
Right.
So, we can be attacked, for not being able to control the microdose doses with microgram precision. But, 99% of microdosers don't do that either because they're also acquiring their LSD from the black market. So, the uncertainties that are present in our study with respect to the exact drug and the exact dose, so on and so on, that's also present in real life microdosing by real people in the real life. And that is what has caused, all of this excitement and hype about microdosing. So in the paper, we are very explicit, and I think the way we put it, which I think was actually it sounds good and it's true as well, that this study is not evidence about clinical microdosing when you are controlling for everything, but this study is representative of real life microdosing as it is happening, which is obviously related to a clinically defined microdosing regime, but it's not exactly the same.
And I think in that context, it might be worth. So if we put ourselves in the head of pharma company, of people stepping into the psychedelic space with some degree of commercial interest, investors, companies who want to test microdosing, the two things that they probably will cling to in this trial, if they might just throw it in the bin before reading it. But if they actually read it, they will probably cling to two things, I would imagine. And one is, as what Balázs just said, but this is not, we don't have full control of doses. We are still assessing and reporting everything about self-reported as best as people would know and think about what dose they were using. But we don't know because we couldn't measure it in this trial. We also could not get people to send in samples and measure them in a lab because it's per law simply illegal to send psychedelic Schedule 1 drugs with the mail. So we couldn't do that. So that would be one thing to cling to, that it might be much better in a completely controlled study where the investigators have control over the exact dose and the exact compound. So that's one thing they will cling to meaningfully. And then the other thing is that, but this was a mix of mainly healthy people. What about in a clinical population? What about people with depression, for instance, which is obviously an extremely impairing and important mental health condition that the psychedelics show promise to, and people are reporting a lot in anecdotes that this really works for their depression and so on. So what about in depression? And that's meaningful to test microdosing in clinical populations, more targeted. But I will say that if people look a bit more carefully into the paper that we have written here, it does not look super promising from this data set either, because we also look back into the subpopulation within our study population of participants. We looked at only the people who scored above a threshold on the depression scale at baseline, so before. So we basically defined a kind of depressed subpopulation of this population, and then we looked only at those to see, could it be that things look better and more favorable for microdosing over placebo in that population. And that didn't change the results. It was the same for this subpopulation. And that is not massively promising for testing it in depression, but it should still be done in a proper trial. I think that's worth, and then the data will speak for themselves in these trials. But I think it's also nice if people remember to maybe think about whether people are actually properly blinded, because what we also, as you know from what we have just been talking about, people to some degree, and which is the same for all trials, can sometimes break blind, and the guessing of what they thought they were taking was really driving the results here. So that's important to take into account, I think, also in future trials. If people do a proper clinical trial, it's easy for them to leave out, because then they don't have that problem to deal with. But I think that's also a take home from this study for future trials.
Yeah, I would just like to reflect on what David said, that I agree that the two major limitations are the lack of controlled drug supply and that our population was healthy. And I am much more bothered by the second than the first one. Obviously from an ethical point of view, we had a limited tools to recruit people for this study, and it would have been even much more difficult to run this study if we would have targeted, say, depressed people. One thing that I would like to add here, because I think this is interesting, and this is something about the nature of subjective outcome, mental health, depression, is that when we looked at that subsample that David has mentioned, so people who do not feel well at baseline, they actually improve more in the microdose group relative to the entire average of the sample. But so does people with a low baseline in the placebo. So I think on the RIF psychological well-being scale, on average, in the microdose group, people improve about 5 points, and the placebo groups improve about 3.8, something like that. If you look at people whose baseline is at the bottom 25%, then the microdose group improves, I think, almost like 9 points, but the placebo groups improve 7.8, something like that. So that, they improve more, but, also the placebo people improve more. And this is something which also has been observed by in studies with antidepressants, with classic antidepressant medications, SSRI. And I think that is just really interesting, that if basically the lower you are, the more the substances can pull you up, but so does the placebo. Anyway, I think that's just an interesting addition here.
I think it's important when you say lower, because I kind of spoke about depression. So in a way, when Balázs say lower, you mean lower on the well-being measure. So which is the equivalent of being higher on a depression measure. But also that also has to do with scope for change. So if people start out being very, very low on a scale, there's more scope to improve than if you're already very high on that scale, and the vice versa with the depression scale. So there's also that element in it. But interesting. So everybody, no matter whether they ended up taking placebo or whether they ended up taking microdose, if they were low on well-being from the beginning, they changed more, they improved more, but in both groups. So again, does not look promising for a better separation from placebo in that group either.
Yeah, and I think, as David said, there are going to be studies happening on microdosing. And I think, I speak in the name of the entire team that we very welcome those studies. It is, we do not think, our results as being conclusive. And that's something, which, I would like to emphasize because of the somewhat of a, you could say, psychedelic backlash, that we are experiencing right now, with this study. There are some clinical studies on microdosing currently. There are 3 out there, and by and large, those are negative as well. So I think our results are in line with the small clinical literature. But even together, the clinical studies and our study, there's just 4 placebo-controlled study on microdosing. So it's a fairly small sample. We could have overlooked something. Maybe we are looking at the wrong scales. It could be, that 5 years later, and let's say 5-10 clinical studies later, when we are having this conversation again, it's going to be completely different because new studies have found something different. And if that's going to be the case, then then we were wrong, and we're just going to have to accept that. But right now, I get asked, quite a lot about how I assess, overall microdosing. And I think what is a fair analogy is that, let's say you guys in America, so let's go with an American football analogy. Let's say if it's halftime, and if you are down, 21-7, can you win the game? Yeah, of course, if you have Tom Brady, probably you will. But, it just does not look promising. And I feel that microdosing is a little bit the same. It's certainly not over, and there are more studies that are needed to really find if there is a placebo drug difference. But so far from what we have in our study and in the clinical studies, overall, it just does not look very promising. Not conclusive, but not promising either.
Promising for the placebo effect, I'd say.
Tell that to an investor.
Invest in placebo.
Yeah, I don't think that, I think the money might come very quickly back in the pocket. But yeah.
Sorry.
Unfortunately for the field.
I just saw a post by Amanda Fielding, and she kind of mentioned this microdosing study, or she stated that LSD microdosing induces significant dose-related changes in BDNF levels, a protein that serves as a marker of neuroplasticity. And it is therefore very clear to me that while placebo might affect in part explain some of the benefits observed, microdosing also produces real physiological changes that are likely to underline the positive effects of mood and cognition. I wonder what your take is on that and her comments there.
I mean, Amanda is as a co-author on the paper as well, and helped us very kindly from her foundation, supporting the few costs that we actually had about setting up this the cognitive testing online, that battery. So we needed to pay for that, and she helped with that. I think that I would agree that it's very interesting to look in, and I mean it's almost paradoxical because I represent a neuroscience center where we that's our thing, that we are interested in looking at the brain, and I'm now leading a upcoming study looking at 3 different imaging modalities, looking at brain plasticity plus peripheral markers with ketamine, and obviously it's very interesting the data coming out that psychedelics are inducing plasticity in preclinical models, and the real human work will be deeply interesting, and I'm very, very keen to pursue some of that, particularly with full doses. But yes, if they do that, could they then maybe be used to induce some kind of plastic flexible state where you could get better through with some psychological interventions, and that can't be ruled out, and that is actually very interesting if that's the case, and that needs to be explored. So I do agree that it is interesting if microdoses on a repeated level, induces a plastic state of the brain that can be then used by adding on psychology onto it. So in a way, I agree, but that doesn't really push to the results that in terms of the scales that are kind of probably even more important if it's just the pure microdosing thing without any psychological addition to it, that if that doesn't do much and doesn't separate from placebo, then in itself that's not promising. But yes, it is interesting with the plasticity for sure.
So the one thing, which I would like to add here is that there are going to be almost obvious trivial physiological changes after microdosing. If you measure LSD metabolites in anybody's blood, it's going to be probably increased compared to placebo condition. And it is, I think, it is one question, whether there are some physiological changes, but it's another question, whether those physiological changes manifest in any cognitive or psychological processes. It could be the case that, yes, there is a very small physiological change, but it is small enough so that it doesn't affect, your working, psychological working or cognitive performance. But actually, this I think is also, a really cool and interesting result. And one thing which I am thinking about nowadays quite a lot is that maybe the 1 month that we had in the study, that was not enough to see the positive effects of microdosing. So actually maybe this is time for a little bit of an advertisement. But so we are planning more self-blinding microdose studies. And at this point, there are like not anything, like we're just discussing, some of the design choices. What are the things that we would like to do differently? But very likely self-blinding microdose study 2.0 will come towards the end of the year. It will be running on the mobile app Mydelica. Mydelica is funded by Robin Carhart-Harris. Both me and David work together with Robin, so it's his company. So it's not a complete disclosure. Right now, I also work with Robin, so it's not a complete coincidence that we are going to do this together. But by having the experiment on the mobile app, that just opens up a lot of experimental space. For example, thinking variables. That we didn't have a chance to do in the first study. And like one thing, which I would like to do is to, loosen the experimental protocol in a way so that people can microdose on days whenever they feel like. Like, they wouldn't be a fixed dose schedule like in the current study. Basically, if you feel like, I could take a microdose today, you can take a capsule. It still might be a placebo or a microdose. But that's something which is like another way of doing microdosing, and many people are doing that. And I think if we adopt that dosing model, then we could follow people for a much longer time period. And then maybe if you follow them for 6 months, then we're gonna see some meaningful changes. Maybe each time you take a microdose, it adds a little bit of a plasticity, but it needs then more than 4 weeks, for that plasticity to have some meaningful change. So, I think these are like interesting results, that Amanda mentioned. I sort of agree that yes, there is an obvious physiological change, but where I a little bit push back is that changed physiology doesn't necessarily mean changed psychology.
No, I think I was in a panel recently about microdosing where people kept asking, oh, but what are the mechanisms? How is it that microdosing work? And I'm like, what? Let's maybe start by seeing whether it works. I mean, it's only so interesting to find out how something works if it works. I mean, otherwise it's less interesting. And so therefore I agree with Balázs that either it needs then to maybe it needs to be tested more for sure before we can conclude that it's very limited what it does in terms of positive outcomes. So a longer lasting trials, which you're right that the app on a phone might allow for bigger samples over a longer time, which would be interesting. Clinical populations, and then maybe the combination of this, if there is some plasticity induction combined with psychology. And I just want to say to Balázs that when you say 2.0, I might say this might be 3.0 because our 2.0 might be our lab-based study
just to add to the confusion.
Yeah, just to add to the confusion, that we are going to do a lab-based version of the self-blinding in London if we get all the approvals, but we are planning that as well. And that will be a study where we will be measuring brain plasticity, not with all the imaging tools we have because of financial constraints, but some very interesting paradigms with EEG and also peripheral markers, hopefully, of brain-derived neurotropic factor, which we can measure in the blood. So, and also other physiological measures like sleep quality and heart rate variability, which is a marker related to stress levels. So we are going to continue with the work, both in the lab that I would say might be 2.0, and then the Mydelica might be 3.0, or the other way around, depending on which one starts first.
Yeah, and if any of the listeners are around London, if they're interested, please go to the study's website, selfblinding-microdose.org, and there you can find email contact to us and just drop us a line if you're interested, and we'll add you to the mailing list.
Very interesting. I guess I have one more question if we have the time. I did think a lot about how you guys mentioned, there was a threshold dose with LSD at around, I think it was 12 mics. And yes. I guess for my mind kept going to, is there any, talk about studies on very low threshold dose? Like that broke the blind, right? And people could tell, but I think there's a lot of people low dosing regularly for benefits. And I wonder if there's any plans to look into that.
I think, just based on conversations that I have with various scientists interested in microdosing, it's going more the other way around. That people want to test more like the 15 and the 20 micrograms, which may be pushing a little bit the notion of a microdose. But basically, with most pharmacological interventions, you expect a dose-response relationship. The larger the dose, the more of an effect you are going to have. And given that, these early studies, including ours, is not really promising, they want to increase it a little bit more, and then, hopefully it's going to come up with something. I am not aware of anybody planning to do studies with 5 micrograms or really under 10.
No, it would be easier, as you say, it would be easier scientifically to do the study because the blinding would be better, because people really wouldn't be able to figure out what they are getting, whether it's an inactive placebo or whether it is a microdose. So on that, but I don't think I agree with Balázs, that's not where people are going to move this. They're going to go in the opposite direction and go higher doses when it doesn't look very promising overall at this point. Then I don't think people want to test lower doses, even though it will be more nicely blinded, but that's not going to give you good effect sizes.
Yeah, interesting. No, thanks for answering that.
Well, and that always comes up with a question for me, and I guess it comes around definitions, right? Of like, I wonder how many people out there are microdosing but taking low doses versus like taking more of these subperceptual microdoses. And I don't know, I kind of get always caught up on those definitions. And it's been a conversation lately as well of what is microdosing for the general community, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's actually this thing about subperceptual. I think that several of this early work here with microdosing is basically saying that the doses that people are using to microdose, most of those doses are not subperceptual, because a lot of people can feel a little bit, and therefore they are actually not subperceptual. They could be subperceptual if you go very, very low, but they are probably a bit lower than what people thought. And also from a pharmacological point of view, that in a pharmacological sense, we wouldn't call that dose range, we wouldn't call pharmacological microdoses. So psychedelic microdoses are not pharmacological microdoses. And we can see that from PET work from the Copenhagen group that basically measured occupancy on the serotonin 2A receptor, the psychedelic receptor in the serotonin system, because we can see that the dose range that people are using and referring to as microdoses, they actually have a significant occupancy on the receptor way beyond what we would in pharmacology refer to as a microdose in pharmacological terms. And that is a bit of a confusing thing. And we are not going to start promoting that people should stop calling it psychedelic microdosing and call it psychedelic mini dosing or something. But if you are speaking in strict pharmacological terms, it's not really microdoses. It's more like mini doses, the range that people are microdosing with, just to make the confusion bigger.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm aware that there are a lot of debates about, microdosing, whether you should feel it or not. I think it is actually not, that crucial, in the large scheme of things. But what's interesting and what I would just like to say is that, so in our study, as Michelle mentioned, 12 micrograms was the threshold. So if you have taken 12 micrograms or more, then you started to guess better than random. And I would quite like to add that there was recently a study last year from the University of Chicago, which is a controlled lab study on microdosing. And they have found the threshold dose to be 30 micrograms. So basically the same as ours. And also, if you look at our data, the average dose, the average microdose that people have taken is also 13 micrograms. Again, there is uncertainty in the doses reported by people, but I think it's interesting that what, at least according to our data, what is the most popular dose is just on the edge of being perceptible. But you are right in the sense that this is just like, it seems to be going on circles. I feel like, sometimes it's the low microdose dosers who are the cool, and then, it loses appeal, and then, then the big microdose people are the cool. And it's just, there is an associated cycle with that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I see that we're over an hour. So I wonder if there's anything that you want to close with, anything that we might have missed that we want to wrap up here with.
David?
I don't have anything in particular. I think we have been quite a lot around stuff. But thank you.
Yeah, awesome. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. And if people want to learn more about, any of these upcoming projects that you're working on, or just anything about your work, where can people find you?
So if you just put in self-blinding microdose to Google, they will find our website, self-blinding, single word, -microdose.org. And that's where they can find more information, and that's where they also can find the study.
But none of the studies are open right now, right, Balázs? None of it is actually open, but it will happen again when we are ready with the volume 2 and 3. But
yes,
people
you found a link where you can sort of like register interest, but they are not live yet, but you can register your interest.
All right.
And we probably will come out with some. I think Robin Carhart and maybe David Nutt. And I don't know how active, Balázs, you are on social media, but I think they will probably tweet when we go live, and I might use my Twitter account that I've used maybe 5 times over 10 years, or whenever Twitter started. I'm so bad at it, but we'll try to announce it somehow, also maybe on Twitter.
Yeah, you are 5 tweets ahead of me, David.
Oh, really? I'm so bad at it.
Well, keep us posted, and we'll spread the word and let people know, and we can get you back on to share any of those updates as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it will be through you guys. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much again. Really appreciated this.
All right. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.